Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Death by Adaptation podcast, a bi-weekly book club where we choose one classic book and compare and contrast it against cinematic adaptations. I'm your host, Nicolò Grasso, and Happy New Year. We're so happy to have you here in 2023, which is going to be an amazing year for this podcast, for all of us, including my lovely guests today. As always, there is Ewan Gleadow. How are you doing, Ewan? How's
Hi.
how's the new year going for you? I'm already stumbling
Would you
on
like
my
to try that
words.
again, or would you like me to just power on through?
Power on through.
Yeah, it's going good. A lot of changes, a lot of things I'm sort of planning on doing. Yeah, I'm looking forward to this year. You know me, ever the optimist.
Yeah, a new
So
year, lots of changes,
I feel like
starting
that
fresh.
sort of that New Year spirit, where you've got like the high of it being a new year, is still lasting, and usually that sort of depletes around now. So I'm
Hmm.
fingers crossed it stays around, because
Hmm?
if it doesn't, then I'll just be sort of like Proust. I'll be bedridden and sleeping away until I just sort of descend, you know. But anyway, other than that, I'm doing great.
Amazing. That's the spirit. That's the spirit that we like to see here. We got to stay optimistic. We got to stay a bit more lively, more upbeat. And of course, we have another lovely guest, friend, and also co-host of the Uncut Gems podcast, Randy Burrows. How are you doing, Randy? How's
Hey,
2023 treating you so far?
good guys. 2023 so far so good. I've made a couple little resolutions in my own little world that so far 3 or 4 days in I'm adhering to. So I'm pleased with myself and my return to the gym and reading
Yes.
reading a bit more and showing up on this show. And I'm thrilled to be here. I'm barefoot in an office building, ready to go.
Making fists with your feet.
Oh, I forgot that part. I'll clench them right now. We're
It's so
good.
uncomfortable. I've tried
Yeah.
it. I don't know why it should be comfortable. It doesn't feel nice. Anyway, you've read the title of the episode, and it's January. It's the beginning of the year. And last time we were here on this show, we talked about Eyes Wide Shut, which is a very unconventional, dark Christmas story. And instead of jumping into something a bit different, into our more regular episode, we decided to carry on and to enter 2023 with the holiday spirit intact, which is why we chose another unconventional, atypical Christmas classic to discuss. Today, we're talking about Nothing Lasts Forever, aka Die Hard.
Mr. Mystery Guest. Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here. Unless you want to open the front door for me.
No, I'm afraid not. But you have me at a loss. You know my name, but who are you? Just another American who saw too many movies as a child. Another orphan of a bankrupt culture who thinks he's John Wayne, Rambo, Marshall Dillon.
I was always kind of partial to Roy Rogers, actually. I really like those sequin shirts.
Do you really think you have a chance against us, Mr. Cowboy?
Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker.
Nothing Lasts Forever is a 1979 novel written by Roderick Thorp. And this book, if you come from loving Die Hard, you probably have never even heard of it. But yes, this is the book that Die Hard is adapted from. And not only that, but this book is actually a sequel to a 1966 novel called The Detective, also written by Roderick Thorp, which stars this character, Joe Leland, a detective, down on his luck. It's this very pulpy, grimy, surprisingly violent noir story. And it was originally adapted into a film of its own with Frank Sinatra. And after a decade or so, Roderick Thorpe decided to revisit this character. And so he was like, let's see what Joe Leland is up to, this World War II veteran. He's almost in his 60s now. He's very beaten down by life, by everything that happened to him. And he decides to, pay a visit to his daughter, who's working in this Claxon Oil Corporation. I was like, yeah, let's go there. He visits the building. They're in a nice little party. He waits for her in the office, starts to prepare a little bit, clean, taking an airplane. I gotta relax myself a little bit. Whoops, terrorists have entered the building. And if you know Die Hard, you kind of know the story, but it's not entirely what you might expect. Randy, what are your thoughts on Nothing Lasts Forever?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Just in a general sense, I didn't know sort of the history of, Die Hard, sort of tracing back to a book which is already sort of a sequel. But a year or so ago, I sort of stumbled across this information, like really interesting. So
Mm.
actually, earlier in over the Christmas break, I decided to watch The Detective, which the first book is based on, and yeah, I didn't like The Detective. That was boring, but it gave me an indicator of what the first Thorpe book would have been. I think that The
Hmm.
Detective was relatively uh, a faithful an adaptation. Um, but anyway, in terms of going through Nothing Lasts Forever, I thought it was a good little read. It's it's brisk, it's well paced. There are some obvious differences. I think we're going to get into those.
Mm.
I will say this, like, as I just finished it a day or two ago, and I feel the information is sort of, fizzling, evaporating away from my brain. So this is pretty good timing to actually talk and record some of my thoughts, because I think as the days go on, I'm going to forget more and more of the details. But it's interesting, and I find Thorpe, he does manage to basically make write a nice pulpy action type of novel. And I don't know if I've read too many action plot based novels, but this is a page turner and works pretty well. I think Thorpe is the type of guy that says, okay, I want to do something that's very genre based, and I'm going to sort of stick to writing a procedural. But he's also looking around him in society and saying, oh, what's going on? What would push the envelope a little bit? So in 1966, The Detective, you have a gay murder, so that would be sort of a taboo thing, and just the way that I think his marriage is crumbling in The Detective, that sort of says to me he's probably interested in the decaying of sort of man's status as head of the household.
Hmm.
And then I think if you sort of, but at the same time, I get the impression that the main character, Joe Leland, is very much um, a cop from the 50s or the 60s. Like, he feels like a dragnet type of guy. And
Yeah.
now in the 70s, he's writing. Honestly, I think that he probably recently saw Towering Inferno and said, "Oh, I should write another cop procedural. Who's the cool cop of the day?" And it's probably Dirty Harry. So he says, "Okay, I'll make Joe Leland more like a Dirty Harry type, and I'll have some of these ideas further about maybe." Ideas about generations, and the next generation are falling into drugs, and they're living a life where they're pursuing greed, and these types of ideas are baked in there. I can more or less take or leave those, I think.
Hmm.
But this works pretty well as just sort of a quick, briskly moving little page turner. It's around a little less than 200 pages, so yeah, it works nicely. I was pleased.
Lovely, lovely. How about you, Ewan? What are your thoughts on this book?
Yeah, just to sort of echo Randy's thoughts, I think page turn is the right word for this one, where it's very readable, very enjoyable, very fun. It was a nice little reprieve, really, around the Christmas period. Obviously,
Mm.
not as well. We'll get into the Christmas comparisons, I'm sure, but with the book, it feels a little less obvious and blatant, where it's kind of just the date and a couple little side pieces here or there to what is essentially just an all right pulpy action book. There's a lot of books that I've read in the kind of the past year or so which were about conflict and not actually showing conflict. So it was nice to have that change of pace where it was actually action rather than reaction to action, which was nice. It reminded me of Rogue Mail, which is a really good sort of post World War II book about a guy that tried to assassinate Hitler and then he's chased down, and it's very interesting. It reminded me tonally quite a lot of Nothing Lasts Forever, which sounds like a Bond knockoff title, but we
Yeah, it
power
does.
on through.
Good point.
Yeah, it's very very solid. It's fine. I didn't. It's like Randy said, the memories and thoughts that come from reading something like this kind of dissipate very quickly.
Hmm.
Not because it does anything wrong, but also because it doesn't really do that much incredible. It's all right. Yeah, it's good. It was all right. I enjoyed it. It's like I'm not sorry it stopped, but it was good. It was all right.
Yeah, Nothing Lasts Forever is definitely an easy read, easier than I was expecting compared to the first couple of chapters. Because it starts off, maybe it's just, knowing what happens in the movie, but it does take its time setting up, Joe Leland, where he is right now, this entire long trip that he has to take to actually go meet his daughter. He's on the airplane, he starts flirting with the stewardess. And there's this little extra relationship present in the novel that had me thinking, okay, where is this going? How is it going to different just structurally to the film? But reading it, I have to agree, it is very pulpy. It does have a lot of this, straightforward moments of just tactical action, which is very fascinating, something I really want to discuss later on. But generally speaking, it really gave me nothing on an emotional level, in terms of themes, in terms of even an exploration of the times. And I find it very interesting, Randy, when you were talking about the story of the detective, at least the film, and how it also compares to this book. You definitely do feel that maybe Thorpe is kind of holding himself down a little bit. It feels like he wants to tackle something grander in this book, a bit of political corruption and criticism of the government and capitalism, the effect of war on veterans and PTSD, and this entire like social political landscape of the world at the time. But then he just keeps thinking like, nah, but this has to be a bit of a pulpy novel. It has to be a bit more action based. So let's just focus more on just now 2 or 3 chapters of this man running around the building, shooting folks up, killing them with axes and whatnot. It gets very gory, it's very violent, shockingly so, dare I say. But yes, for me, it was all right. I have to say, it's a bit of a cop out, but I agree. It's all right. It's forgettable. That's probably the worst thing I can say about the book. I read it. It's been a week since I did, and the memories, Randy, are gonna fade even more. Give it a couple more days. They're gonna start fading even more. All the little details. But today we were not the only ones who were supposed to be here for this episode. The good Jakub Flash, the creator, founder of the Uncut Gems podcast, was supposed to join us, but sadly he couldn't make it. But he did send a couple audio messages. And let's listen to the first one, talking about Nothing Lasts Forever.
All right. Good evening, boys. It's 9:44 on the 3rd of January 2023. This is Jakub coming to you live from his car on his way to the gym to sweat and deadlift. Okay? And then here are my thoughts about Die Hard. And actually, well, scratch that. First of all, here are my thoughts about Roderick Thorp's Nothing Lasts Forever. Because I suppose we have to start with the book. So apologies for not being able to make it to the recording, which is happening as of me speaking now. It's happening tomorrow, but tomorrow's also happening to be a massively stupidly busy day at work. So apologies if that I couldn't make it. But here are my thoughts, nonetheless. I'm already 1 minute in. I haven't even started talking about the book. This is Jakub, by the way. Anyway, so. I came to read this book having only the knowledge of the film it was then adapted to, which is Die Hard. So for me, reading this book was kind of accompanied by quite a few surprises because, well, surprise, surprise, the book is quite a bit different from the film. And I have my feelings are, about how this book relates to the film, and just to spoil it a little bit, is kind of similar to how I feel about Peter Benchley's Jaws, as in like this is a solid book that was adapted into an absolute action masterpiece, but more on that later. Anyway, so the book is a solid page turner. This is exactly the kind of book you'd pick up at an airport and then spend 3.5 hours sat in the middle seat between 2 obese people trying to survive on your way to wherever the hell it is you're flying, and then just entertaining yourself reading a book that's absolutely disposable, has zero value whatsoever to your brain, intellectually completely disposable, but it's fun to read. It is a kind of a fun thriller, and actually what makes it fun is the differences from what the film ended up being, because the film I know by like the back of my own hand. So like Joe Leland is an interesting character because he's a little bit older than John McClane. He's a bit ruthless. Like if I had to compare him to any sort of character from that I know of, it will be he's kind of more like Gerard Butler's character from Olympus Has Fallen, which weirdly enough is a Die Hard knockoff. But hey, so he's this sort of like ruthless guy. He doesn't really have a sense of humor about himself. He doesn't really see himself as a cowboy. He's just a guy on a job taking terrorists out one by one, girls, boys, old people, who he doesn't give a shit. So it's kind of fun to kind of just look at what he's doing and then see how he progresses, and then just like there's a twist to the book. Because like the company's different, there's a political undertone, and actually in all, like, I know the book probably Roderick Thorp probably wanted to kind of have something to say about the politics of his time and about the sort of like American interventionism and how they just meddle with other countries' affairs, and then this is how like the chickens come home to roost. It doesn't really matter all that much because the antagonists are not that memorable. Like they look like they should be, but they're not. So it's essentially like reading a transcript from a video game sort of treatment that never got adapted into a video game, so it's a bit weird. So that's kind of my thoughts on the book. It's a fun little sort of solid read, but it's completely disposable. I'm actually quite amazed I remember more than I this much about it, because I'm almost like a month removed from reading it, because it is actively evaporating from your cerebral cortex as you're reading it. But yeah, so it's a solid read, but it's a toilet read is what it is. Like, I'm not kidding. Like, it's not it's not Shakespeare, it's not Hemingway. So yeah, so these are my thoughts on the book, and with that I'm going to go and do some squats. So see you guys later.
That was Jakub, ladies and gentlemen. Pretty much we're all on the same page. The good Jakub is now doing deadlifts and the bench presses. It is what it is. But one of the main differences that we'll talk about, and let's just dive right in, is the protagonist and the characters of this book. You have Joe Leland, you have the character of his daughter. We're used to there being the wife. He's going to the party to meet his wife. Instead, here we have the daughter, who's a bit of a scummy character, She's just free doing drugs in the office. She doesn't really care about her father. She's corrupt. She's part of this organization, Texan almost organization, that's heavily corrupt. And the same even applies to the villains. Jakub kind of touched briefly on it, but the group of terrorists is a bit more diverse in the sense that there are women in here. There are 4 women in the group of terrorists, which is already kind of a pleasant surprise in a way that also leads to some rather uncomfortable moments, which have me thinking, how much does Roderick Thorp want to kind of subvert elements of genre fiction, because you usually don't kill women in stories, but in here there are some brutal kills. What are your thoughts, so fellas, on just these characters and the darker tone that this book has? How about you, Randy? How about you go first?
Well, yeah, it's certainly there. I think that this is Thorpe. Like, I think he's a pulp procedural police type of writer, and I think though that he has these thoughts that he wants to ram into uh, his books. Like, that's sort of the sense that I get. He's got these ideas that push the envelope, and he wants to include them, but they don't necessarily fit into what he's writing organically. So I like, they feel a little bit crammed in. It's like, oh, okay, well, I've got this cool idea now because I watched Towering Inferno, and I'm going to turn it into a police procedural. And times change, man, times really change. So this guy Joe Leland, he was a pilot, and then he was a really successful cop, and he solved some of these big cases, and then he went up through the ranks, and then he was let go, and now he's a private contractor. So I think he's saying things in these, but at the end of the day, like, I think he's just writing a pulp novel, but he's trying to sort of shove all these extra ideas in there. In terms of the darkness, it's interesting, but again, like, it's this offshoot that's worth discussing, but somehow it's not elevating this. Like, I'm not really like, what's the point? I think he's saying the times change, and maybe as part of that, he's looking at, I guess at this time, maybe back on Vietnam, or the economy, or these other things that are happening in the world at the time, and he's saying, look, in Vietnam, the Americans were corrupt, but all that's doing, when you go out and you piss off other nations, that's going to come back somehow. Because it was the Munich Olympics were in the 70s, right? And that's,
Yeah.
pissed off people coming back. So I think he's taking these ideas from the news and sort of shoving them in here. I think he's okay with going dark. I think he's okay with going, more sexual. I think he's got ideas about the role of men changing in here too, because this is a guy that wasn't able, Joe Leland, this is a guy that wasn't able to maintain a couple different relationships. I think he had a wife and a second wife, if I'm remembering, and
Yeah.
he's struggling to keep a relationship with his daughter. And, he makes this new relationship with this flight attendant. So I think he's saying that the traditional role of men over the years, like through the 40s and the 50s, was very much man is the head of the household. And I think he's making a comment that this is all changing, sort of courtesy of, the mid 60s and on. So I think that's sort of baked in here, but it's not necessarily organic. I think it's just, this is a grumpy old man, Joe Leland, that's just sort of saying this, saying, oh, in my day, things were different. This is the way that it is now. And, these kids today, they're just motivated by money, greedy bastards. And, like, I think there's a bit of that in here. Like he's making these fairly blatant statements, but it's just
Yeah.
something, it's an observation, and it's not really caked in here. Yeah. And what I'll say is like a nicely organic way, or a particularly literary way. It's there. It's interesting to talk about. So maybe I shouldn't make it sound too insignificant, because, he is doing something somewhat interesting, but I don't know. It doesn't resonate. It's just sort of this interesting, corridor that you go down to explore in his writing. But then, after you have a couple moments of, Joe Leland's cranky thoughts or reflections on a failed relationship, then, well, it's back to the business of, taking inventory on what's on this floor and what's on that floor and how many are left. And so I guess that's sort of my thought on those types of elements.
Yeah, it loses itself a little bit in those tangents for me, and to the point that especially they're very heavily present in the first part of the book. And I was thinking, oh my god, this is going to be all of it. And I was kind of intrigued by the idea of that. Just have this man stuck in this office building, and he's just thinking about the state of the world. It feels like there's potential for something deeper there, and even the fact that we're talking about a man, I don't think he ever clearly states his age, but if you consider that he fought in World War II, that's in the 40s, 30 years later, he's at least 55. Maybe even
Yeah.
older, maybe even
Yep.
over 60, and that's an interesting age for a protagonist. I wonder if maybe
Yep.
we were talking, Towering Inferno, but then you talked about the older gentleman. I was thinking, man, maybe he was kind of imagining Charles Bronson in the role, or someone like that.
Yeah.
Just this angry, just tired old man just
Yeah.
keeps on fighting another day just to fight crime and fight the injustices in the world through sheer brutal violence. But it also kind of loses some of those elements throughout, because I don't know if it's just the rage, but he becomes a bit more agile when it's convenient, and those tangents kind of take away from some of the more tense moments towards the second half, where you're like, okay, now we're talking about more international intrigue and terrorism and problems in Cuba, which kind of tie also into the ending, of course. But yeah, definitely lost me a little bit there. How about you, Ewan?
It feels as though he wrote the set pieces before he wrote the message he had for it. Because you'll get a moment where it's like, oh, war is hell. I remember when Hiroshima happened, the tragedies, the horror, and then the next sentence is, anyways, I caved someone's head in and I battered the terrorists to death. And it's just such a jarring process that it's kind of, not that it diminishes the value of the message that is being portrayed. I
Yeah.
do think it's an interesting message. I think a lot of it is a lot of cross wires, a lot of unsureties, shall we say, from the author's perspective to project onto a character that is essentially just an extension of his father, because Thorpe used to work at his old man's detective agency and just plants his father in all of his work, which is fine, it's good, it's interesting. The issue is, however, it's kind of just not connected almost. It feels really independent of the action, and the action feels very independent of the messaging. And it's like, Randy, you sort of listed off what it could mean, whether it's a criticism of money, whether it's a criticism of war, family unit, the move on from it. I don't know if Thorpe knows. I'm not convinced he's quite sure of what he wants to portray. I do think Leland's a very interesting character, though, especially the age of him. You know, when we look at action films, especially action books, essentially, it's always a young heroic protagonist with a six-pack and massive muscles, and he's ready to save the day for everybody involved. To think that Leland is an alcoholic coughing his way through air ventilation systems in a plaza is, it's a change of pace. It's not cemented because we don't get a feel for how old Leland really is. We can place it ourselves as readers, like, oh, he's a World War II veteran, 30 years on, okay, we get a general idea, but to not cement it from Thorpe's perspective is kind of cowardly almost. It lacks the commitment needed. And I get why, because this is just a pulpy, fun action piece. And as Jakob said very, very clearly and very rightly, one of those books you pick up at an airport. It is one of those. But it also it's frustrating because it has such potential. It has the potential to go on and really make a statement or make a claim. And all the pieces are there. It's just jumbled up. It's confused. It's sort of overwrought in the wrong places and underbaked in others. And it's just kind of, it's disappointing because Thorpe does have some good bits to it. I really like the sort of diary entry almost perspective of it, where it's counting down the time until Christmas Day, and then it shifts, and then it's Christmas Day. It's the next segment of the book. That's really smart. It's a simple touch, but it's as a narrative tool, it's kind of signifying, okay, here's the first act, we're leading into it, and then boom, fantastic. It's just kind of a shame that the perspective of his character and what he actually wants to write is really muddled, where, you've got an ex-cop sort of mulling around going, oh, woe is me, and then at the same time Thorpe's like, I want him to blow someone up, go on. It's a perspective that needs a bit of balancing, but I can't help but respect that the fundamentals are there. It's present, it's something that is mused on. However, I'm not fully convinced. But again, it's a fun book. It's just enjoyable, and to give it credit, it has more depth than the movie, which I'm sure we'll discuss later. But it has more of a perspective. It has more of a placement of an era. It has that sort of ability to say, well, this is kind of connected to this period of history, which is great. I think that's really strong. However, I do think the simplifications and the changes to the narrative and the characters made by the film are just superior, because not just of the visualization, but because it streamlines everything. It still makes a point. It still makes a concerned criticism about the family unit, about the changing role of man in that. But it just focuses in on that a lot more, and it takes out a lot of the brutal killings, even though there are a couple in Die Hard.
Do you suppose that Thorpe had this idea, you know what, we should do something like all these terrorist incidents and hostage takings, we should take something like the Munich Olympics and put it in Towering Inferno, and that was his idea for the book. And then when he's starting to plot this out, he says, you know what, I should bring Joe Leland from my other book into this, and that's how I can get my cranky old man themes in here. Like, I wonder if bringing Leland into it was a bit of an afterthought.
I can kind of see that.
Yeah. It's kind of one of those things where it accidentally serializes a book that at first had no connection, where you just bring a character back.
Yeah.
I don't wish to mention Albert Camus in the same podcast as a Joe Leland feature, but obviously Albert Camus did the same with The Stranger and a Happy Death, where it was the sort of, I can't remember his name, was it Machamps or something like that? But it was the same character brought over to books, not because really of any thematic consistencies, but just because it was a memorable name at the time. As far as Leland goes, I have no idea. He's just a representative of what Thorpe thinks of himself, I'm sure, or his father even.
Yeah, there are even those moments where he talks about older cases, and I'm pretty sure, I mean, you watched the movie, Randy, like the case that he's talking about is the one from the detective, correct?
Yeah, the one, like, he talks about, he was in their first chapter or something.
He got the wrong.
Leland says, like, he's been in the public eye 3 times, and one had to do with being a pilot, and one had to do with solving this big case, and that big case is what's in the detective.
There you go. Okay, yeah. So it even brings you up to speed, you know, in case, you don't remember Joe Leland, this great character. Let me introduce him to you.
Joe Leland, traffic stopper. I remember like the opening 20 pages of that book. To be honest, I really didn't mind that opening 20 pages. Like, I like the novelty badge thing. Like, there's little details like that that really do well to cement Joe Leland for people that don't know him. Because let's be fair, not many people have read The Detective. And rightly so.
Apparently, yeah. But speaking of which, just Thorpe's writing, outside of those moments of those detours that he takes, I did quite like the way he describes action. I don't know how much of his own, like, I don't know if he was a Tom Clancy type of guy, who actually went to the private range to shoot some discs up in the air and targets and learn about the various weapons and all of that. But it does feel very tactical. There is a clear intent in every action that Leland makes, but also the terrorists, that make this a far smarter thriller than I was anticipating. I think Jakub kind of touched on that as well in what he was saying, that it's so readable when it's just about the action that
Mhm.
it's kind of
Yeah.
pleasant to read. Like I have to agree in that sense. Like Roderick Thorp knows how to create cool set pieces, cool sequences of just tension, and without losing himself too much in pointless descriptions. He keeps the action going. I don't know how you guys felt about all of those moments where Leland is stuck in a room and he has to shoot his way out, or he's waiting for the elevator, or he hears footsteps and he's just waiting to see. It's entirely subjective as well, which makes it more tense, more nail biting at times. Like, oh my god, like you're feeling this man's fear of not knowing how many men are in the building. You never really cut away to someone else's perspective, which always keeps you grounded in this man's body. How do you guys feel about like just the action and the way it's described?
I'm a fan of it. I think it's pretty solid and it's quickly moving. I think something that you're onto, Nick, is that it's all from his first person perspective, basically, and it
Hmm.
doesn't really deviate from that. In terms of how it's written, something that Ewan was saying that registered with me, because he said that he worked in a private eye firm or something, right, for a while. So I wonder if that's where you get the detail oriented approach that I do feel is in the book. Like,
Hmm.
what I do like about the text that is not so much in the film is you've got this countdown. All right, there's 12, and there's one on the roof, and there's one on the bottom floor, and there's got to be three with the safe, and like he's doing this, and I've killed three of them. Pardon me. I really like that, and he goes up and down the floors all the time, and he's taking inventory of, okay, well, it's desks on this floor, and it's an open space on this floor, and they're probably on this floor. So he's making all these deductions. That's probably coming from his background in studying cases, or being sort of having a bird's eye view of cases as they're unfolding, and that's probably leaning into his writing. So I like that. I will admit sometimes I was losing track, because he would say, oh, I'm going on such and such a floor, and that's all desks. There were certain elements I would lose, because when he refers to that floor again, and he's making some sort of comment, and it takes me a while to clue in, oh, that's the floor that has all the desks, or that's the floor where he made his fortress, or that's the floor
Yeah.
where he's holding it. I was losing those types of details. But anyway, like, I think that it's an interesting approach, and it's a very solid subjective first person type of writing, and I did like that element, because it did feel sort of tactical, and sort of boots on the ground type of thing with Leland in this experience. So I did enjoy that angle, and that style of bringing Leland's action to the reader.
Johan, do you have any thoughts? Did you like
No,
this?
I've no
This.
thoughts on anything. No, I think it's going to sound silly to say kind of that writers are imaginative, but I think
Mhm.
a lot of what Thorpe does is really creative, in the sense of he gives a scenario that most readers will have read before in their pulpy action novels, and then presents a real unique way of getting out of it. And it was the scene when he's in the air vents and he's sort of lowering himself down. When I first read it, it was like, oh, we put his right leg in and then his left leg, and I thought, well, that's just a necessary detail. He's padding out a very short novel. And then on reflection, it's kind of, he builds tension in such a unique way. He builds it in the style of, this is a slow procedure, this is something you need to be careful with. There's real detail to the assembly of his build up to the set pieces, but like Randy said, it gets confused almost, where it's I get it, it's a skyscraper, there's lots of floors, but there's no real vast way of knowing which floor is which. where his fortress is, where the hostages are, where the base of operations of the terrorists are. It's manageable. You can power on through, but it would be nice to have a bit of a better placement. But I suppose that lends itself sort of almost to the confusion that the war Copper's going through, where he's climbing through air ducts and firing about terrorists. It does create a sense of real danger. At the offset of that, it does create a lot of confusion and uncertainty, not just in which terrorists are left, but also in what's going to happen, in the sense of the narrative's taking a bit of a tumble here. What's going to happen next? And it's not a good tension of, oh, I can't wait to see what happens. It's more of a, oh, I hope this doesn't go too badly for Thorpe's writing. Which is, I'm rooting for the guy. He's clearly writing a book that means a lot to him, and you can kind of tell that, after writing The Detective, he does want to write another detective novel, but he gets stuck writing Towering Inferno, but instead of lava, it's guns. Which is fine, I've not seen
European
Towering
terrorists.
Inferno.
I
Yeah.
wonder if part of his style is something that I'm seeing as a problem, but maybe it isn't. Maybe he's generating his pacing. Whenever Leland has a moment to breathe, then we get a little bit more description, and we get sort of his, Steffi, she's probably doing all kinds of crack too. Like, oh, my daughter, like we get all these musings because the character has a chance to breathe. But then when things get, more intense, then the description's a little less, because I noticed there was a lot of things going on at the end, and there were a couple things I was like, what is he talking about? People wanting more money on the street. And because there was a throwaway line, I went back a couple pages on how they threw money out the window, and it's like, totally missed that. Now that's on me, the reader, but at the same time, like, I wonder if he's intentionally pacing things a lot quicker, and his description's shorter, and things are happening faster, and that just goes hand in hand with maybe the chaos of the moment. Maybe it's a very intentional thing.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, it's maybe
It's very
maybe he's brilliant, and I just don't realize that.
It's really good, but then at the same time, it's like in the middle of a firefight, it'll be sort of thought will cut away to something that's completely mundane. It's like, oh, better make sure there's no thefts when I've left the area, and it's just kind of,
I wonder how the flight attendant is doing now. I wonder if she's waiting for me.
Yeah, it's like, oh, I've murdered 2 terrorists in cold blood. I wonder if that phone line's being connected. Yeah, I kind of need that for Christmas Day to let the in-laws know I'll not be home.
It's the only thing keeping him going,
I mean, it's probably for the best that Die Hard is not a faithful adaptation. It's the same. It's the bones and all issue of how do you get something so good out of something so strange. Obviously, in the case of Bones and All, strange translates to bad. But for Thorpe's case, different strokes for different folks.
We'll never stop shitting on Bones and All the book.
Every podcast this year, I'm going to mention it. Shit all over it. Still not happy with that. It's been 6 months.
Jeez, yeah. But speaking of just the last major difference before delving into the film, as you mentioned, like, thankfully some things have been changed. I'm so happy that in the film we have Hans Gruber compared to the books Little Tony the Red. Anton Gruber, aka Little Tony the Red. I was like, whoa, whoa, Little Tony. It's not the most menacing villain name, It's actually the last thing I would think of. But that's, again, like, that's an interesting little wrinkle, the fact that Joe Leland actually has knowledge of who some of these people are, because they're internationally renowned terrorists. And when he sees them, like, from far away, he's like, "Oh my god, is that Little Tony? Is that this other guy? Is that the brother? Is that this Italian fella and the lady from wherever?" So it doesn't necessarily make it more personal, but it does add a little bit of character to the entire group of terrorists that was kind of lacking from the movie later on, as we'll
Do you
see.
think that's on purpose, though, where it's, he knows how ruthless these people are, and when he gets to writing, it's like, I'm going to call him Little Tony.
just
on purpose, to
piss him
diminish
off.
the value as people.
I wonder if it's a side effect of simply keeping this first-person POV, right? So, and then if Joe Leland is written as a guy who's sort of aware of some of these, then that's a way to communicate the ruthlessness and the seriousness and sort of the international flavor. The fact that he knows what's going on, and he can sort of embark on these embark on these themes or these other ideas that he has off to the side, because otherwise it's that much different if he doesn't know what he's up against, right? So
Yeah.
I now that we're talking, you guys are saying things that make me feel, yeah, like I think that his whole point is that this is very POV type of an approach, because you never jump to another character's shoulder, I don't think,
No,
right?
no.
I don't think there's any instance of that. So how do you spend time with, little Tony? You just you don't, but you can build him up by the things that Joe Leland, the character, tells us in his thoughts. Oh, yeah, this is sort of a dirty guy, and he's knows all kinds of stuff about that Chilean bridge or whatever.
Why did it have to be little Tony though? Because I was waiting for like the big bust up between them, and little Tony whips out a stepladder so he can clamber it up and meet eye level with John McClane, and that's the big Leland. It's a shit. Like, I get little was like a mafia thing where it was like a tagline, but
But
out of
he's
all of them,
German. He's really
yeah,
fun. He's the son
you
of an
know,
SS officer.
those German mafia men.
Classic. My
it's
favorite.
it's like the model idea of Thorpe just sort of running with the punches he's trying to throw in there, where it's like, oh yeah, he was in the mafia, and then oh yeah, he's got a tax return to fill, and oh yeah, he's just shot 3 people. Oh yeah, there's a hatchet, and it's a real massive car crash. But I get it. It's kind of, that's the reason people read pulpy novels. Is it doesn't really need to make that much sense. It just needs to be entertaining, and by all means, Nothing Lasts Forever is kind of.
Yeah.
Which I don't think they'll put on the front cover of the reprint, but it's sometimes interesting.
Unlikely. But thankfully, Nothing Lasts Forever was not necessarily a big hit per se when it came out. It really did kind of end up being the bargain bin novel at an airport, like Jakob described it. But it was still part of a property, and 20th Century Fox owned the rights to this story. And in 1985, we got Commando, the classic Arnold Schwarzenegger vehicle, massive hit, made gangbusters, and it was written by Steven D'Souza. And this was like, we can kind of, we have this property, we have this little book, sequel to Detective. It's called Nothing Lasts Forever. This could be a cool Arnold vehicle, just put him in a building full of terrorists. He has to save the daughter. What was it, Alyssa Milano, who was playing the daughter, something like that. Just she's a bit older right now. She's working, whatnot. Yeah, let's do that. D'Souza wrote the script. They were forced, contractually obligated, actually, to contact a 72-year-old Frank Sinatra to ask him, Frank, remember the movie you did 2 decades ago? You want to come back? Want to come back for it? Which, of course, he said no. Then they also proposed it to Arnold. They were like, yeah, this works so well with Commando. Why don't you come on board? And Arnold actually declined. And they went through a whole list of other people, including, Stallone and other action stars of the time, to kind of try and make this one-man army story set inside this office building. It all fell apart. Good old John McTiernan came on board, and they managed to get this man, Bruce Willis, relatively young, relatively unknown as an action star. He was known for more dramatic roles. He was working on TV a lot.
Mm-hmm.
It was 1988, and this movie came out, Die Hard, different title for the better, and the rest is history. It's movie history. This has gone on to become one of the most acclaimed action films of all time. It is endlessly quoted to this day. It spawned a 5-picture franchise, probably not for the better, but it's been going on up until, like, was it 2013 with Another Day to Die Hard? I don't even remember, the one set in Russia, and it kickstarted the career not only of Bruce Willis as an action star, but also of the lovely, wonderfully talented, and sadly late Alan Rickman. Fellas, what are your thoughts on Die Hard? When did you first watch it? How was it like revisiting it for this podcast? Ewan, why don't you go first this time?
I Die Hard is actually one of the so how do I explain this? So when I really first started in journalism, I did video game reviews, and occasionally I would do movie reviews. I'm pretty sure Die Hard was one of the first ones I did. Thankfully,
Oh.
I scorched earth that review. It's no longer available anywhere. I think I even deleted my own copy of it. Nonetheless, it was an early doors thing that I'd seen when I was about 16, and now I'm tender old age of 23. And it's been a constant. I watch it a lot, where it's kind of like it's a Christmas movie. It is. So I watch it at Christmas, but then it's also, I'll stick it on in the summer on like a lazy afternoon. It's just a perfect film. It's a nice length, good characters, simple plot, lovely, nice bit of kit. As far as the kind of the relationship I have with this film, I said before this podcast, I review pretty much everything I watch. I've never reviewed Die Hard. Part of me wants to keep it pure, just because I enjoy it so much. It's like the Harry Potter films, I've not reviewed them. But with Die Hard, it really is special. Like I don't say that about many films, but it really is, like, fundamentally, not just as a personal. This is a wonderful film, one of my favorites. As far as actually what it did for the action genre, what it did for the franchise, merchandise type big film, it was very innovative. And you wouldn't think so, because again, like you said, Bruce Willis wasn't really that well known as an action star. Alan Rickman, because of this film, became a celebrity. There are so many assets and creatives involved in this that were kind of unknown at the time, even after that mixed reception it initially received. Just went on to huge things, and rightly so, because it is fantastic. It's such a good film. But I watched it a couple of days ago because of Christmas and stuff. We all gather around the TV as a family and watch Die Hard. It's wonderful, brilliant.
Amazing. Lovely, lovely. Warms my heart. How about you, Randy?
Yeah, I have a long history with Die Hard. I saw it back. I didn't see it in theaters, but I did see it on video, and I've always liked it. But usually when I would watch it, I was in a group of other people. Like I'd watch it in the dorm with other people, or I'd watch it with buddies or whatever. So I can't say how many times I've seen it, but it's just the last few years that I've returned to it. And Die Hard's always been satisfying, but over the last few years, so let's say over the last 5-6 years, the last 3 times or so that I've seen it, I just keep appreciating it more and more and more. It's just really solid. It's not perfect, and it sort of speaks to the 1980s and Hollywood films in the 1980s. I have some issues with, just in general, their bombastic silliness at times. But you know what? Die Hard never lets me down. Like it's solid, it's consistent, it's great paced, and it is one of those transitional type of films. Like I would say this and Speed are these types of films that
Yeah.
when they came along, then action films after would try to emulate it. And this was it. So it's just one of those iconic landmark types of films that changed the industry in a way. It certainly launched those careers. I think another thing that it didn't just launch Alan Rickman into stardom. It launched that type of character into a necessity. So in the 90s, I think one thing you see in action films is you've got films that are trying to be like the Arnold and Sly action films, but with an everyman like Bruce Willis. And also, I think that you've also got like the 90s over the top villain. Like the 90s over the top villain, I think starts with Alan Rickman here, because it's almost like we oftentimes on Uncut Gems will say, well, it's not Shakespeare. Well, you know what? This is almost Shakespearean, like the way that you have these competing personalities. And this is something that I think that Die Hard is an example of Hollywood interference helping a project, because usually it's a hindrance. But here, some of the ideas that D'Souza and is it Jeb Stewart? Sorry, you just said, but
The
yeah,
co-writer, yeah.
yeah. So and then any producers, if this ever went to committee, they come up with these ideas that they're saying, okay, well, you know what? Killing women, especially younger women, that's not cool. That's got to go.
It's a
You know
big
what?
no.
This is complicated. That's got to go. You know what? We don't want a 60-year-old. That's got to go. And all these changes, I think, tighten this up, because you're moving. Not only are you moving into film just in terms of the narrative, but you're also moving into a visual medium, which action is all about. So I think all the choices are correct, because you're simplifying the narrative, so you can focus to a certain extent, on the visuals and on the set pieces and on the action and all these types of things. And this is what I would think is a rare example of Hollywood interference is improving the source material, and the source material is perfectly all right. But I think that almost every change that's made here pretty much is for the better, or at least lends to film better than what the text might have if it was a little bit more faithful.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. To me, Die Hard is one of those lightning in a bottle movies. It's just everything came together in the perfect way. I genuinely would consider this one of those perfect movies in the sense that it does everything that it sets out to do just masterfully well. It's perfectly structured. The action is tight. It's
Mhm.
brutal. It almost reaches the level of a Paul Verhoeven movie from the time, almost like a Total Recall and RoboCop, without getting too graphic to the point that a 12-year-old cannot enjoy it, and the whole family can gather around to see it, even though it's R-rated. Um, it manages to be memorable every step of the way, and it's relentless in its pacing without ever tiring you out. I think it's brilliant. It took me a long time to get around to it. I'm ashamed to admit, because it's one of those movies you always hear about, and you're always watching clips of it every time someone's talking about it. It's like all the scenes, the yippee epic trails, all of those moments. You watch Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and it's quoted pretty much once per episode in one way or another. But then I've seen it now 3 times fully and multiple times in bits and pieces. But every time that I've seen it in full has been in January, so it's almost like a post-Christmas tradition, funnily enough.
It's
But I,
easy to take for granted and not
yeah,
actually see the brilliance of it, and just think, because it's always been there for me, like, and I'm the oldest one in the room, like, but Die Hard really has always been there. So it's easy to take for granted, but you start to look at it and you sort of drill deeper. It's awesome.
yeah,
Just
it's
awesome.
a founding text of modern action cinema. It really did change the times because, like you were saying, yeah, you go from the 80s to the 90s where people want to see someone more relatable in films, and then you actually kind of see that circle back again, where you get to the later
Mhm.
Die Hard sequels in the 2000s. I just watched today the fourth Die Hard, not to get lost into all of that, but it is fascinating how the cycle kind of keeps repeating itself. I do feel like we're entering now, after the superhero fatigue, we're gonna want a new John McClane. We don't
Mhm.
want, little what's his name, Tom Holland just playing Nathan Drake, completely invulnerable, falling out of airplanes. We want someone more grounded in reality, like John McClane. But of course, I just got a message. The good Jakub is out of the gym. Let's hear from him and see what he has to say.
Okay, it's 25 past midnight. Yippee-ki-yay, motherfuckers. I just came out of the gym. Came out of the gym, had a few lifts. So I feel like I'm in the right frame of mind to talk about John McClane, because I feel like how he felt at the end of the film. Tired but happy. So I just want to say, it's probably a good idea I'm not there with you, because I'd be just moaning for like 2.5 hours about how great this movie is, because Die Hard is the best action film ever made, period. Possibly. If not one of the best. I mean, I can't decide, but it's one of my favorites. And it's not even because it's a Christmas film, which is not. But where was I? Anyway, so Die Hard, as a film, it's just such a great piece of action thriller filmmaking. You can't possibly believe that someone put it together. John McTiernan put it together, and Jan de Bont lensed it like an absolute fucking boss, you know? And then it just gets so many cool things right. And it's just late 80s, and then with this sort of action man, muscly sort of action hero just already becoming a little bit stale, and then just Hollywood doesn't really quite know how to reinvent itself, like they're trying with their buddy cop movies, Lethal Weapons sort of kind of taking over, and then along comes this idea of reinventing the action man. I think Lethal Weapon is probably a good example of that, where just let's introduce a little bit of comedy into this. Let's introduce a little bit of levity into the operations. Let's just merge this sort of idea of this brutally violent action thriller and then just make it funny. Just make not only make it funny, make the action man an everyman, an every action man, every man action, action every man. Okay. You know, this is just the best idea ever, which is also the best improvement on the book. Because, as I said in my sort of book thoughts, you know, like it's kind of like Jaws, like a solid book turned into a great script by way of actually taking the main character and making him less grizzled. I mean, he's still grizzled. He's still a little bit he's a bit raunchy. He has some dirt under his fingernails. He has a shitty relationship with his wife, which is, by the way, just the best sort of change, because he's not going after his daughter. He's trying to save his marriage. Okay, this is like the River Wild, Randy. Okay, he's David Strathairn. What was I? Yeah. So John McClane, as reinvented from Joe Leland, is the best change you could possibly make to this story. Second best change is actually making the villains likable, which was also just, I don't want to say unheard of, but it's one of those things that really didn't take off, I think, before. I think Die Hard, like the idea of making these villains almost, if you squint, you could almost get on board with their idea, you know, because they don't look like they have a political agenda like they pose like they do, but they're actually thieves. And then, you know, and they have the Ode to Joy play when they open the vault. It's the best. Which also brings me to Michael Kamen. Michael Kamen's score is amazing. Like, this movie is amazing. This movie rocks on all fronts. It's just fires on all cylinders. All 12 of them. It's a Rolls Royce of a movie. W12 Rolls Royce. You know? When you just floor it, it's like £100 right there. You know? At this point, I'm not sure what I'm talking about, but I'm happy that I'm doing it, and I'm unhappy that I'm not there with you. But probably you're happy I'm not there with you, because I'd be just moaning this whole time and I wouldn't allow anybody else to speak, because that's just my superpower. So I'm gonna leave it there. Die Hard is the best action film of all time, or maybe one of the best films of all time. I love it with all my heart. I can quote it at my leisure. It's the best, you know. It's just it's a relationship drama mixed with a comedy, with an action thriller, and it's also a single location. The geography of the film is amazing. It's just the perfect nugget of action filmmaking, the Hollywood style of blockbuster set piece driven filmmaking you could possibly imagine, especially at the time that it was released. It almost, I don't want to say single-handedly refreshed cinema, but it kind of did, because only after that you have the sort of idea of, oh, Die Hard on a boat, Die Hard on a bus, Die Hard in a fucking prep school, you know, Die Hard everywhere. You know, it's not. You wouldn't be saying these things if Die Hard wasn't absolutely the best movie of all time, which it probably almost is. So I'm gonna leave it there, guys. You go and speculate about why this movie sucks. I don't know. I hope you won't, because friendship over, you know. If you hate this movie, I can't be friends with people who hate this movie. So I'm gonna leave it there. You know, happy trails.
Well, I hope we're not disappointing you, Jakub.
The ramblings of a madman.
Bless you. But
Hot,
no,
high on the gym.
Yes. You
Good
can
on
feel
him.
he just went through his own Nakatomi Plaza incident. But I agree with pretty much everything he said. What I found particularly interesting that we didn't touch on in our opening gambits on the film is the Shane Black influence, which is actually something I didn't connect timeline wise, but the first Lethal Weapon did come out before Die Hard, and that was also, you know, written by Shane Black, who worked on Predator by John McTiernan, which came out before Die Hard. So there's a little bit of an overlap there, maybe a little bit of, you know, talking to each other, a little bit of an influence. But the humor definitely helps a lot. The humor is something that's sorely lacking in the book. It is far darker, far more serious, barely any levity in any way in Thorpe's writing. But the film is completely different. It's almost say borderline, almost an action comedy, in the sense of like a Little Weapon, where it's keeping things light, keeping things fresh, without necessarily taking away from the impact of the violence and the seriousness of this situation, as you could say. Um, but speaking of the differences, like there are a lot of those. Jakob mentioned, for instance, the fact that this film is about, McClane, not Leland, but John McClane, trying to save this relationship with his wife, which is far more creepy than what happens in the novel with the daughter. The daughter character is a bit forgettable. You don't really care about her. She's already unlikable once she's introduced, but you never get a real sense that you kind of want her to be saved. We haven't even talked about the ending yet, but we will. What happens to her? But who's Bonnie Bedelia as the wife of John McClane as Holly Gennaro? Amazing, amazing. I think the entire casting here just does a brilliant job. Everyone's just put in their perfect roles. And and the other key difference, and then I want to uh hear you guys talk about some of these things, is just the fact that this movie is not in a first person perspective. We're not exclusively in John McClane's perspective. We're seeing things also through other characters' eyes. I don't necessarily agree that the terrorists slash thieves here are likable. I mean, they're watchable. They are very enjoyable. I don't know, Jakub, if I would say they're very likable in that sense. Um, but it is definitely a more colorful cast of characters. So I'm curious how you guys feel about some of the key differences, of of the film compared to the book. I know, Randy, you seem ready to go.
Yeah, sure. Like I'm with Jakob on pretty much everything too. Like I think, and it goes to some of my opening thoughts that I think I feel I've covered a little bit of this ground already. I think that this here is Hollywood. So the screenwriters and whatever producers were on board with this, like if this went through some sort of committee, and then went through these screenwriters' hands, they have made all the right choices in terms of making this an action film. I think that Joe Leland's complicated history with women, like if you're more faithful to the novel, Nothing Lasts Forever, I think that it it's not going to be an 80s action film. It's going to be something, an independent 90s, film, because it's going to be more introspective and thoughtful, and it's going to be more about these themes, and it's got to be filmed in a way that allows to go to these darker places. So turning this into sort of a palatable and accessible action film, which is what they were doing, simplifying the daughter and the relationships with women and all of those angles from the book, simplifying that into a guy saving his marriage. It's perfect. And it actually even goes to the same types of themes, I think, that are in both the detective film and also the novel Nothing Lasts Forever, about men and relationships and their role in relationships and their ownership of their mistakes, and saving a marriage and being there for your kids, and sort of trying to find that balance of home life and supporting your partner, and even the whole business of women in the workplace, because Bonnie Bedelia, she's a very powerful woman. Like she's the number 2 or the number 3 in this organization. That so it's actually presenting a lot of these same themes that we were talking about in the novel, but it's all simplified, and it works a lot better. And in particular, I like the fact that you've got a less grizzled, less cranky. It's just a different character to ride shotgun
Completely.
with, John McClane. And I think it totally works. I think that making action films, and this is, if you think of, well, what's an action film? This is it. This is the template. Like it nailed it. You're either talking about the Muscle Man action films, or you're talking about Die Hard in some fashion. Like even Speed, which I think is another one of those landmarks. It's a Die Hard, right?
Die
Or you're
Hard on a bus.
or you're going all realistic, and it's something like Top Gun. Like there's like Die Hard is the template of an American action film, because it just nails the tone with the lead, like a likable guy It's easy to, follow him. He's tortured, but, you're not going to be all up in airs over his problems, and you're not going to be distracted by it. It's, there's a nice simplicity to it, and Bruce Willis is absolutely perfect. So I think he was coming off the Moonlighting series, which I never watched, but I think that's sort of a drama comedy type of thing. So he had some comedy chops, I think, in him. That comes
Mm.
out here in a very natural way. Just some of his line deliveries are great. I think that this and also maybe what Mel Gibson is doing with Lethal Weapon, like they're creating this the one-liner type of action film. And I don't know if they've been done better than in Die Hard and in Lethal Weapon. And so now when I hear these crazy one-liners in an action film, I find them sort of a pain. That's like that's a vestige of the 80s and 90s. But this is when it's done best. So yeah, I'm totally fine with pretty much all the changes here. I'm trying to think if there's anything that I don't like. Like, again, there's interesting stuff, I guess, to explore, like the idea of the daughter in the book. But in terms of turning it to an accessible action film, there's a lot of that stuff that needs to be carved out. Otherwise, it's a completely different picture, and it's certainly
Mm.
not being made in the 80s.
Yeah, I completely agree also with what you were saying, Ewan, earlier about the film just lacks themes with a capital T, which is something that the book kind of has, but only marginally touches, about anti-American sentiments and all of that. Yeah, it's one of those
Like the
cases
way I
where people.
pack a suitcase. Like I put
Mm,
everything in I need, and then I get I want to include these other things when I go travel that I don't really need, but I just try to cram it in the suitcase anyway. And I think that's the thematics in the book.
yeah, this one is keeping it light and efficient, and it just.
It's a lot better because of how streamlined it is, and obviously you've both pretty much put that in the words I would have used. So I'll see what I can do. No, it essentially takes a look at Thorpe's writing and goes, okay, there is something in here. It needs untangling. It needs not rewriting per se, because the elements, the fundamentals, the core structures of that story, where a cop has navigated his way to a relative's party. Terrorists have taken over. They're searching for an object. He will stop them. That fundamental is pretty much most of Die Hard, and most of it translates to the screen. The major changes are, as Jakob said, as Randy said, as Nick said, the little details, the simplifications. I get what Jakob meant when he said that the terrorists are likable. They're not likable. They're just well written. To the point where they're interesting. They're actually they feel like they have a goal, whereas in the book it just feels ironically a bit simple considering everything else that's going on. There is a great disparity between the hero and villain archetype in the book compared to that of the film.
Mm-hmm.
The film feels simpler, but in the same effect and the same strand, it lets the audience just transfer what they're thinking onto characters rather than the other way around, where the book is saying, this is about this, I have criticised the culture of money. And everyone goes, oh, right, okay, sorry, Roderick. And then Die Hard, you got a nice story, you got a simple streamline, you can just watch that for a bit of fun. And then at the end of the film, you go, well, wasn't that a nice commentary on something? And it's just a nice disparity. It's one of the great. I do think it's one of the great action films. I have a real soft spot for Commando though, with Arnie.
Hey.
So I think that might have just pinched it there for the top spot. But Die Hard, I mean, like you've said, it has a real legacy that is afforded to very few films. I can think of very few films that are kind of at that level where everyone's watched it, everyone's seen it. It's like Home Alone. Everybody's watched it. Another Christmas film.
True.
Yeah, but it is one of those films that fundamentally kind of just needs to be watched. There's no particular reason for it. It's just a very good film. It feels like an elevate. Obviously the film bro films like Fight Club and The Dark Knight and stuff. It hasn't ended up in that brand, but at the same time hasn't ended up in any brand that was associated with kind of enlightened art. It's a real all-rounder, and I think a lot of that comes from Rickman and Willis, their performances, the back and forth. There's a fundamental simplicity to it that kind of engages the core of what good versus evil is in film. It's very simple, it's very straightforward, it's very plain. Add in a few little bits and pieces, bit of action, bit of dialogue, when it's at the right tempo, it makes something like Die Hard.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I particularly love more and more each time I watch this movie. Is just, and yeah, I'm sorry, Jakub, talking about not liking the terrorists. They're not relatable, but they actually, after hearing you talk as well, Ewan, they're likable, especially like Alan Rickman, man. Alan Rickman, he's not Little Tony the Rat. He's
Yes.
Hans Gruber. He has a
Yes.
memorable name that sticks. Just a little difference. You need Hans. You already put Hans Gruber. It just works. It's really fits better. But he manages to have such commanding presence from the first moment you see him. When he starts talking, he just controls the room with such presence. And he manages to talk about, the sharp suits that he's wearing, but also he's not afraid of just shooting someone in the head and getting his hands dirty. It also makes him more scary, I'd say, because more often than not, especially that's actually one of my favorite points that Jakub made, where had me thinking like, wow, he's right. Action villains were very different before this. I think you either had your grunts. I think like in Lethal Weapon you have your Gary Busey. It's just
Mhm.
like he's there to be the heavy basically, and then you have the smart one, or you have the James Bond villain who's this overly calculating, controlling mastermind, pulling everyone's strings, and blah blah blah. But Hans Gruber manages to be both menacing in a physical sense, in terms of just he gets shit done. He's not afraid of shooting someone if it needs to be done. It doesn't always make the things. It doesn't always have someone else do his dirty business, his dirty laundry. But also he manages to be smart, be clever. That's one of the nice things that they actually managed to take from the book and implement in here, is just how tactical everything is. The use of booby traps from John McClane, the way that Hans Gruber thinks, "All right, I've seen him not wearing any shoes. Let's just shoot the glass of the window so he's gonna start bleeding out, probably to death, hopefully." Uh, all these various plans, they're so engrossing in a way that's just fun, 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 fun. And even the rest of the terrorist group, it's not as varied per se as the one from the book. I would definitely say that the approach that Thorpe has is more fascinating, but the way that it's
Mhm.
implemented here, it just works. It's right for the movie that they're in. I don't know if it makes sense.
Um, I just want to launch off on a little bit that you guys are talking about in terms of Alan Rickman. So I'm thinking to my head as you guys are talking, like in the 80s, like the development of, so if you're going with fairly simple narratives, good versus evil narratives, so you've got, um, the Bond villains are a good idea. That's a good example. And I think, and then if you go into kids cartoons, especially like He-Man and Skeletor and
Mm,
GI Joe and Cobra Commander, you've got, it's very visual. So the bad guy, and you get that in Disney as well, right? Like the bad guy has warped features and a big head, and it's all visual. But I think this is one of the, and with Lethal Weapon, mind you, you got Busey, and is very evil, but no one's going to compare, I don't think, Gary Busey in Lethal Weapon to Alan Rickman here, right? Like, and I think what this here is the start of with Rickman and the loud, huge 90s over the top villain. It's coming from, here's a guy who is big and animated, not visually, not because he's got a crazy outfit, but because he is a commanding performer. And I was just looking up, and then sure enough, Alan Rickman is a graduate of Shakespearean theater, right? Like that's what he
yeah.
studied. And you get these amazing performers, who just, they can, they make the transition to film because of their stage skills. And you get a lot of British actors have that, just that Shakespearean quality. They can command the theater, just by their look or their posture or very simple blocking, and they're able to bring that and break it down to minutia of acting for the camera as well. And Rickman does that. Like, he is so much larger than life, but his suit, I guess it's an expensive suit, but it doesn't stand out. His hair is not wild. He's not a big man. Like, he's not ferocious or a thug in any of those types of traditional bad guy. He is a
Mhm.
guy who just commands the camera, the way that a strong Shakespearean actor commands the stage. And in a way, so then you've got these big performances that come out of villains in the 90s, like, and then you start to get Oscar nominations for these types of roles, like Al Pacino and Dick Tracy, and um, Anthony Hopkins and Silence of the Lambs, and
Yeah.
you just get in the 90s, that was the new villain. um, and I think it all probably comes back to Rickman, to be honest. So Pacino's nomination in 1990, and maybe even Hopkins' Oscar, that goes back to Rickman's work in a way.
Even
you know
Misery, I can think of for
yes,
the female side.
there's
Katie
another one.
Bates.
That probably comes right out of the literature, but it's certainly a fit, right?
Mhm.
And maybe the way that, because that was really popular with audiences as well, maybe that's why it's a fit. It's because you've got this powerful performance, this powerful villain. It's an everyman who's the villain too, right? And that's sort of what Rickman is. That's what Kathy Bates is, in Misery, Annie Wilkes.
Mm.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And now, like, as we're sort of going through this, I think you're right. Like, because Lethal Weapon, the bad guy, he's sort of a thug type, and then any other good versus evil, I'm thinking of, well, the good guy's always clear, but what made for the villain? And it was often something visual, or they were crazy, or they were yelling, or their head was really big, or it just,
Get with a fist fight. You
or
gotta have a
yeah.
fist fight.
Or in North America, they had an accent, and maybe that's part of the start of the performance here,
Yeah.
with Rickman. But you know what? Like, I think that it's his powerful stage performance that's coming through here, like his ability as a stage performer. I honestly think that's a big part of it, and he just was able to command a film audience the way that he could command the front 10 rows of a theater performance. Like, that's as you guys are talking, I'm like, yeah, like, what's special about this? Because it's clearly special, and I think that's sort of what it is that he's the everyman villain, but he's bigger than life in terms of his performance, without yelling or spitting or being crazy, right? Like, he is so subdued and quiet, and the looks, like, his posturing is just fantastic. Like, he acts so much with his eyes, and like, he's got these great moments where
Mm.
it's the posture of his head and he's looking out of the corner of his eyes. And then on top of that, you've got the great voice, and just sort of a ruthless tone to his voice. And anyway, I just wanted to go into that, because that's something that's special, that comes out of one decision. And I don't know if they had this level of genius in mind when Stewart and D'Souza wrote this, but taking this away from strictly POV, and it mostly is John McClane's story, but they do go over to the office to have some moments with Hans Gruber and Holly, the
Mhm.
Bonnie Bedelia. Like, they have these side moments, and they work really well. They do take a moment to go to the news station, and they spend a moment with the cop on the street. So those are opportunities for us to breathe. But I think when that decision, and sort of, let's jump over here a little bit just to flesh out the story, that choice, and with this villain particularly, makes this a special film, because that allows Alan Rickman to really, really come forward with this strong performance and be something special. But because, again, like, as we were saying, in the book, you're always tethered to
Mhm.
Joe Leland's shoulder. Well, here you're not, so we can see really how ruthless this villain is, right? So that's my 2 cents worth on Alan Rickman, the late great Alan Rickman.
It's the sophistication of that stage portrayal as well, sort of coming to life on screen. It is wonderful. I'd be worried to be kidnapped by him. I think I'd just immediately succumb to some sort of Stockholm syndrome. Just not even over days. Just be the snap of my fingers, and that's it. I'd be away. Whatever he wants me to do. If he wants me to walk towards Bruce Willis with a grenade vest, that's fine with me. It's Alan Rickman's asked me to do it. What a
Very
wonderful guy.
charismatic.
He's a real charm, and it's he elevates a lot of the stuff he's in. I'm thinking that the sort of every British actor has to appear in a comedy film in the mid 2000s. It was mandatory, and he did one called Keeping Mum, And he
Oh,
was delightful. He was really nice. Him and Patrick Swayze did well to sort of navigate their way through that. And again, it all comes down to the sophistication of it, that fundamental charm. It's wonderful, and Die Hard's a beautiful place for it to be sort of championed.
yeah. It was brilliant, genuinely brilliant. And I think there's one of my favorite scenes of the film, which is, as we've talked about it, structurally, film and book are fairly similar on a superficial level. This happens and this happens, and the building is without shoes and goes up, and the bomb explodes, and a couple people die. All of that happens. But there is this one scene that's missing from the book that I really, really, really love in the film, is when Alan Rickman and Bruce Willis, John McClane and Hans
Mm-mm.
Gruber meet face to face before the final confrontation, which is just brilliantly staged. Just Hans Gruber going to the rooftop, kind of checking for the explosives. Okay, everything's working fine, and boom, John McClane is there, but John McClane has never seen Hans Gruber. He doesn't know what he looks like, unlike the book, where he's instantly like, "Oh yeah, it's little Tony, little Tony," you know. And it's a small change, but it makes for a very tense little scene where you have Hans Gruber just instantly switching into this flawless American accent, kind of overplaying it a little bit, but it works. It fits, and it's just like, "Oh, I'm panicked. I'm trying. Oh yes, I'm running away from the terrorists. Oh, help me out." And that entire sequence, I don't know if you guys really like that scene, but just to me, it's always one of those moments that when I get to it, I'm like, yes, yes, I love it, because it creates even more tension between the characters, and it makes it a little bit more personal instead of just the two of them facing off at the end. It's like, yeah, they've been talking through the walkie talkies and whatnot, but it's not the same as having this like showdown without really knowing it's a showdown until the end of the scene, where everything falls apart, the charade from both sides.
I don't think that scene works, and I also love that scene. I don't think that scene works as well if you don't make the decision to jump off of John McClane's shoulder, right, and
Yes.
show some other things that are
Hmm.
going around. It really fleshes that out, and actually, I think that is a precursor in a way. I don't know if there's any influence or not, but the the diner scene between Pacino and De Niro in Heat. It's around the
Ooh.
same point in the film, 2/3, 3/4 of the way through the film, and they square off, and it's a meeting of two. It's iconic visually because you've got good and bad, strong good, strong bad characters, and you've got this very interesting exchange. It's all dialogue, pretty much, and the audience knows what's going on. The audience knows both sides and who's playing who,
Hmm.
and they know why it's not coming to blows right then and there. There's a reason it's not coming to blows right then and there, same as the De Niro and the Pacino thing. And it's just this great standoff that doesn't have to go to blows 2/3, 3/4 of the way through the film. And it does, it amplifies the good versus evil. So yeah, I love that scene. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah. In a way, you could even say that's part of the Christmas atmosphere of this story, because Christmas stories, I kind of took the piss out of them when we did the episodes on Gremlins and Gremlins 2 on the Uncle James podcast in December, which you should definitely check out if you're listening to this. But they do have at their core this idea of kind of reinforcing certain values, especially about family. How do you guys feel about the fact that this is a Christmas film compared, especially I know you, Ewan, were talking about the book where it's just kind of like, yeah, it's set at Christmas literally, like it is on the 24th and 25th of December or close to it, but it never really feels like it. How does it compare to just the film, which is seeping into Christmassy atmosphere?
I think the biggest example you can get from Die Hard is when the elevator doors open and he's got the jumper on which says "Now I have a gun, ho ho ho," and that's it. It cements it as a Christmas film. You've made a reference not through iconography but through actual dialogue that it is now Christmas. I think fundamentally the sort of is it a Christmas film debate comes down to what people perceive as a film being Christmas oriented,
Hmm.
whether it's the values of Christmas or the actual iconography of Christmas. Die Hard has both, so I don't see the
Yes.
issue.
Yeah.
It has the literal Christmas trees and presents and the gift giving, all the commercial aspect of it, but it also has the core of family needs to stick together in, festive times, regardless of whether or not you're sort of being, harbored by terrorists. It's really quite clear. And, the debate of, is it a Christmas film? People that say otherwise are just contrarians for the sake of it, and, don't really deserve to watch Die Hard.
I'm into that. I'm into that.
I'm one of those. I don't see it as a holiday film.
Randy.
I've got a like hate with this type of like, I yeah, sort of. I
It's less Christmassy than Gremlins.
yeah.
For you?
Oh, I think Gremlins is, all in Christmas. Like it's sort of wraps itself around Christmas themes. To me, like I think that debate has taken off just because it's cool to do so, right? So now people watch Die Hard every year, and if that's the reason they need to watch Die Hard once a calendar year, God love them, go for it. That makes me happy. But is this a Christmas movie? No, and I would say the producers at the time didn't think it was a Christmas movie because when was it released? It was released on July 15th. Now you might say that was something that studios were sort of clueless on because they released Gremlins on June 8th in 1984, and I think
Just fascinating
Ghostbusters
choices.
2 was also a summer movie, and that's a New Year's film. But to me, this is the action template. This is, this has in it a family theme, but I don't know. It's a pretty big reach for me to say that, this has the values of, Christmas and family and togetherness. Really, no, not really. Because I think it was Jakob actually, he tweeted and he was saying, well, are there any films out there that aren't set at Christmas that you would take to be a decent Christmas movie? And one idea I had, like The Straight Story, which we talked about on Uncut Gems. That is a film that is filled with family values and all kinds of togetherness and embarking on maybe redemption and New Year's resolutions type of mentality. And so what it's going to what you're saying, actually, Ewan, is what does someone consider a holiday or a Christmas film to be? And I don't know. To me, Die Hard is just tangentially but so what? Like another film that I would say fits the same vein is P2. I don't know if you guys have seen that. It's Wes Bentley is this creep that abducts.
Oh wait, yeah,
Rachel Nichols, I think is her name, and it's just sort of a one guy pursuing this lady on Christmas Eve through a parking garage that's closed in.
I've seen that.
So it's a holiday movie in the same way. It's set on Halloween. Go Go is the film that I would like more people to see every year on the holidays because it's set during the season, and there's a case to be made for family values and togetherness and friendships and stuff in that as well. So, but to me, ultimately it's tangential, which is great, and those are great themes for a story to be revolve around. But is it a holiday film? I don't know.
It's one of those things that it's kind of grown on me over the years because I watched Die Hard with everyone talking about this element. It is a Christmas movie, isn't it? The first time around, I didn't really care that much about it, but then it's present everywhere. I think a little bit like it starts off like it's going there for Christmas, and there's the Christmas music playing on the radio. Christmas tunes are part of the soundtrack diegetically and non-diegetically. The use of Ode to Joy, like you mentioned, Ewan, is very memorable, even though I've never really considered it a Christmas tune. I know in America it is known as a Christmas tune, maybe even in England. I never really did, maybe because it is the European anthem, if I'm not mistaken, but the European Union maybe. But it does, yeah. You have the Christmas hat on the body and the ho ho ho. You have all of those references, I think, that kind of make it. Yeah, but I kind of make it a Christmas film. I think so. I'm in the camp where it is a Christmas film. Because, similarly, of course, in the same vein as Eyes Wide Shut, as we talked about, that's also a movie that's not necessarily reinforcing the themes of Christmas per se. Maybe in a twisted, demented way, yes. Of just sticking with your family. Don't go to masked orgies in unknown places. But
not on the Lord's birthday.
Not on the Lord's birthday. That's on the 26th. Then you can do it. After that, you can do it. But even like Tangerine, that's another atypical Christmas movie that kind of
Yeah,
still manages to insert itself in the iconography of Christmas without necessarily being about it. Uh, but it's fun. It's fun. Like I don't. I know some people really go to bat for those things, but it's always just cute to me. I don't even remember if any of the sequels are set around Christmas. Maybe the second one when he's in the airport. I don't know. I don't know if they ever try to
think
replicate
so.
that setting. No.
Yeah. Yeah, and I have fun with those types of conversations as well, like films that are set around Christmas, call it, but tangentially, they're only Christmas movies sort of tangentially, like Gangster Squad, as I recall, like that.
Yeah.
Like there's a shootout in that, like in a big lobby that's decorated for Christmas, and
The massive tree.
L.A. Confidential, like there's a bunch of them, but Brazil for that for that matter,
Mm.
Anyway, so
Definitely works all around the year. If one were to watch it in July, for instance, still works. Still a great movie. Still very enjoyable. Um, but the last thing I really want to talk about is the endings, or dare I say, the endings, because we didn't really touch on the ending of the book, which is fairly different from the one of the film. Because in the movie, everyone who's listening probably has seen it and knows what happens. Happy trails, Hans. John McClane shoots Hans Gruber. Hans Gruber slips. Holly Gennaro is almost falling off the window. John comes, check, unclenches or like removes her watch or whatever bracelet that Hans is clinging onto, and he just falls, plummets to his death. John McClane, everything's saved. Yay! Oh wait, Carl is still alive. These other terrorists we forgot about. But boom, boom, boom. Al shoots him. No more casualties. Finally, happy ending. Christmas tune plays. I don't even remember which song plays at the end credits. It's amazing. It's lovely. Everything's fine. The book is very different. The book takes a much darker turn. In the book, when the little Tony the Red falls to his death, he's actually dragging the daughter of Joe Leland with him, and she falls, she dies, and this messes up with Joe to the point that he goes on this blind, violent rampage. He ends up killing two more of the terrorists that were left alive in a brutal, even disturbing fashion. I was like reading those sequences is rather grim, rather grotesque. And when he reaches the lobby and he's just covered in blood and whatnot and heavily wounded, the Carl equivalent kind of comes out and he starts shooting and he kills multiple people, including the chief of police, before he's put down. And that's it. It's just like, and Leland will probably be saved maybe by the ambulance and by someone in the ER. Who knows? Doesn't really matter. It's just very, very grim. How do you guys feel about just how different for a story that's fairly close in terms of book and film, just superficially? This is the biggest change of them all, and it's just whoa. Like, what are your thoughts on this? No, Ewan or
well,
Randy. Randy, you go first.
sure. Well, I think that this is sort of Thorpe's thing, and this may
Hmm.
come from his, background being on the ground floor of different investigations and probably seeing a number of, frightful real world things unfold. But this is what I see now. It's the movie, but going to the detective, he wants to sort of push the envelope in terms of violence, in terms of the way people
Hmm.
talk. He wants to, use language in the detective that was not cool, not spoken at the time. Like, and he's going into the LGBTQ community for murders, and like that would have been very taboo at the time. And
Yeah.
I think that's just what he wants to do. Like he wants to push that envelope. So now with um, going into the 70s, and I'd suggest he's sort of maybe modeling Leland off of Dirty Harry, or a more grizzled type of main character. So he's moving Joe Leland sort of into an older, crankier type of character. But as part of that, he still wants to push these ideas and push the envelope, be a little bit more violent, be a little bit more risky, and go places that the other pulp novels that are on the same shelf, they're not going to go. Like I think this is him trying to be bold and braver, and that's just what it is. And like as I was saying before, when Hollywood has this property and they want to sort of adapt it to, something that's amenable to distribution in the 80s, well, we can't do all those things, Roderick. Like, really, we're going to kill like a 30-year-old? Like, and really, at the end of the day, why is the daughter? Because we're going to have to cast like a hot actress. So why would we vilify her and make her be strung out on cocaine if that's the one you're saving? We don't want to save people like that in the 80s. Like these ideas, like, let's sanitize this a bit. And like I say, it's a miracle that some of these decisions, because these are sort of interesting ideas, like I feel they're sort of crammed in a little bit to the book, and not necessarily natural feeling, but at the same time, like it's interesting that he's going there, and he's a bold writer in that type of way. But I think that for the sake of simplicity and making an accessible picture in the 80s, I think that actually the sanitation of it that takes place totally works. Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. That's my take. Is that yeah, go for it. I yield the floor.
I think that, yeah, I'm just going to agree with that. I think the big change for me is that obviously, especially at the time, the late 80s in Hollywood, it feels like the family core right at the center. It's the family values movie. If you go with what Thorpe was interpreting, it's pretty dark, especially for that period. So it does feel a bit Hollywood. It does feel a bit, not even that it's a cop out. I think it's a good ending. I just think it's plays it a bit safer to sort of accept a wider audience, and there's no real downside to it. It's a good ending. But Thorpe had some nerve. I thought it was pretty grim and sort of more based in the realism. There's more drama to it. There is more collusion in the sense of not everything turns out well. And I think for him to put that ending in with such a brutal build-up is really strong. I thought it was really interesting. I do prefer the Die Hard ending though, because that makes my brain hurt less.
It's more acceptable. It's easier to digest. Yeah, there's definitely an element of, I would almost say, conservative Hollywood that one could uh, put on this film. It's not particularly breaking the mold in any way. Die Hard, but it works, like you were saying, Randy. Like it's all the decisions that in other movies they would suck. They would probably lessen the experience, make it much weaker, much more forgettable and bland and generic. But in this case, lightning in a bottle. Once every 20 years, it just works. And this is one of those instances. Um,
I will say I'm not that thrilled about the Carl coming back, and then getting plugged by Powell. Like that feels as awkward in some ways as it does in other films of the 80s. Like that's just a trope coming over from slashers that,
the last one last scare.
Yeah.
from Scream, but they had to give little Carl something to do, because it's the it's the redemption arc for the character, because he's talking about, I'm doing a desk job because I failed, I shot the little kid and I wasn't supposed to do it. So this is redemption. He saves himself because he saves John McClane and everyone else by shooting Carl dead on the spot. Violence saves the day once again.
Yeah,
Yay.
yay, violence. Yeah. And that's the piece that the
Learn to
screenplay
shoot.
sort of crams into the suitcase at the last minute.
Yeah. I agree. It's probably the only real sour note in the entire film. It's the car just literally walking into a busy lobby with an AUG, just this massive machine gun, just kind of like, I'm gonna kill you, John. I'm gonna kill you. It's just a little bit more believable in the book, where he just does start randomly shooting at people because he's concussed and just angry. So it's a bit more understandable. In the film, instead, he's just like, I'm just gonna walk over. No one's gonna care until I shout. But it's a Hollywood movie, and it ends on a fittingly Hollywood note. But speaking of endings, we are at the last stretch of this episode, which only means one thing: the last question. Randy, after this conversation, which version do you prefer? Nothing Lasts Forever or Die Hard? The book or the film?
It's gotta be the film.
Hard
It's
choice,
just
hard choice, right?
it's just gotta be. It's so tight. It's just, like it's a landmark. It's a landmark that other landmarks after it point to, in a way,
Mm,
at least in American cinema. And yeah, it's just, in some way, it's just fantastic. Everything sort of works. And then I think you've got, this um brilliant antagonist protagonist dynamic, which is new and fresh at the time, and is seldom matched, in all the different attempts, in the 90s, of having that, crazy, wild, standout villain. Seldom do they line up with Rickman, and I'm increasingly convinced that this is sort of the first iteration of this, and it goes to this stage presence type of being big while being small type of performance. It's truly a special film. And the more I think about the scene that you brought up, about they have this moment where they meet, and uh, John McClane doesn't know who Hans Gruber is. That's just an amazing moment, as well. Like, it's just, this is just a really rich film, and it's just consistent, and it works well. Yeah, nearly perfect.
yeah, speaking of the villain, they do try to replicate that with Jeremy Irons in the third one, which is, literally playing the brother of Hans Gruber. I like the film. I do like the film a
Yeah,
lot, but it's, like you said, it's nowhere near as tight as this one.
yeah.
It's nowhere near as well balanced in every single aspect as in Die Hard. How about you, Ewan? What's your
Oh,
pick? This
oh,
hard choice.
it's a tough one. Do I go with a film that I've watched for the past 7 years of my life intermittently, or do I go with the book that I've already forgotten the title of? Um, decisions. I think I'll go with the film. No, yeah, the film's got to be. I think again. It's. I mean, Jakob mentioned Jaws as well, which is a great comparison. I've read Jaws, and Jaws isn't particularly great. It's fine. Again, Nothing Lasts Forever is fine. It's an all right read. You won't be bored reading it, but you will forget it. I don't think I've forgotten Die Hard yet. I still remember the sort of little details, those little moments that just make it transcend the material it's based on. I think that's the crucial thing.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's got to be the film. I don't think there's anybody out there that prefers the book to the film at all. I'm
Oh,
not convinced.
they're gonna come out of the woodworks. Don't worry,
Yeah,
they're
well,
probably
I've
out there.
I've got enough on my plate. The Avatar 2 fans are after me this week. They don't
Oh,
like the fact that I've called it sludge,
oh.
which it is. It is, to be fair.
You're in good company with Mark Kermode and Robbie Collins.
Get in.
the,
Big man
the
Collins bumping into him at Venice, and now we share the same opinion on Die Hard. Well, I imagine Die Hard and Avatar 2 as
he
well.
probably likes Die Hard. Yeah.
He'd better.
But yeah, I completely agree with both of you. I imagine the good Jakub who's listening to the also completely agrees. The film Die Hard is just incredible. Just I think what you said there at the end, Ewan, just it does transcend the genre. I think one of the biggest compliments that I can give this movie is the fact that my sister really likes it. She does not like action movies at all, and she likes Die Hard, and that's what elevates this. It's the fact that it is an action film, but it's one of the key rules when they talk about making an action scene work or making an entire action movie work. The action has to move the story forward. It doesn't have to be there just for spectacle. And I think Die Hard, more so than even other movies, understands that perfectly. There's no gratuitous fistfights. There's no shootouts that don't actually have an impact. Every shootout leads to one or two deaths of one of the terrorists. They lead to John McClane getting wounded, getting beaten up, just falling on glass or something. There's always consequences to the action, and I think that's ultimately what makes Die Hard so special, is that you really care. You really care about everyone, about everything that happens, and that's what makes it just a special film. But this is it for this first episode of 2023 of the Death by Adaptation podcast. I'm so excited for the lineup that we have ahead of us, and of possibly recurring guests as well. Speaking of which, Randy, where can our listeners find you on social media?
You can find me on Letterboxd at Brad7. You can find me on Twitter at Randy Burrows. And you can find me with you co-hosting the Uncut Gems podcast with our good buddy Jakob Flash.
Yes, yes, lots of good things on the plate for Uncut Gems in the future. A whole full-on retrospective on both Soderbergh and Cassavetes, as well as themed months all year round. So definitely go check that out if you like this podcast. Ewan, speaking of podcasts as well, where can our listeners find and hear you?
Yeah, just on the internet these days. No, they can. You can get me on Twitter and Letterboxd at Ewan Gleadow, EWANGLEADOW. You can get my writing on Clapper, Cult Following, Daily Star, Daily Mirror, and they can hear me on things as well, like Death by Adaptation, and also my music podcast, Don't Listen to This, which
Yes.
at the time of recording this, I've got 2 episodes to edit, and I just can't be bothered. So maybe there'll be more, maybe not. I think there will be, because
Do
I'm
it,
on a
man.
bound, because that conversation I had about Elvis Presley was quite good,
Oh.
with a musician from the Savoy in London, which is a very nice hotel. So if you're into pianos or Elvis Presley, and the thing, what was the thing he said? Oh, cheers, lads, or thanks very much, or whatever. Whatever he said, you can get that on Don't Listen to This.
Amazing, amazing. Do check it out. I know I've been on the podcast a couple of times. Also, friend of the pod, Carson Timar, has been there. It's a lot of fun if you like bite-sized discussions on music and classic albums and why they shouldn't be on the list of the 1001 albums you should listen to.
You've
So
explained my podcast far better than I ever could. Thank you.
that's
Could
why
you
I'm
write
here.
my Twitter bios?
Oh, bios. I'm terrible at bios of
Oh, they're
any
awful.
kind. Sadly. But still, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at NikiGra97, and there you have links to everything: Letterboxd, YouTube, my short films, all of those lovely things. Of course, you can also follow the Death by Adaptation podcast on Twitter and Instagram, respectively, Death Adaptation and Death by Adaptation Pod. And stay tuned. Be sure to follow us, subscribe if you're listening on YouTube, drop a like, 5 stars, whatever, because we got a lot of good things planned for you. For instance, in 2 weeks' time, me and the good Ewan here will be back to talk about one of our favorite authors, to talk about Irving Welsh, to talk about Train Spotting. It's gonna be a grand old time of absolute nastiness, Scottish nastiness. I feel so dirty. I'm halfway through the book. I feel so dirty. Like I need to take a shower every time I read like 50 pages of it. Amazing. So stay tuned for that. We hope you enjoyed this episode. We hope you have a lovely 2023, and we hope to see you again soon. Bye bye.